Hello everyone, Newick Games here with another video in the tutorial series of remaking the core version of Getaway Shootout. In the last video, we took a step aside and actually looked at possible alternatives that you could take this game moving forward. But in this video, we'll return back to the original Getaway Shootout game and start coding the final solutions to get this game into a racing game. So in this video, we'll actually be implementing the Waypoint system. And the Waypoint system was just a solution that I made in the original Getaway Shootout game that served two purposes. The first purpose was to actually make spawn points into the game. So basically, in the original game, spawn points would be scattered across the map. And actually, I'll just jump to the original game. So spawn points would be scattered across the map as these waypoints, and once the player reaches that waypoint, and after they die, they'll start spawning at that certain point. And when they reach to future waypoints, they'll make that as the new spawn point and start spawning from that point. So that was just a simple spawn point system. And the other reason, the other use of this waypoint system is actually to guide the computer movement. And the computer movement, as we'll see in future videos, actually just follows these waypoints moving to the next waypoint in that direction. So a lot of these waypoints in this map that I created just serve as directions to guide the computer movement around the level. And basically just telling where to jump. So that was the solution that I came up with, combining these two purposes. But you could come up with a solution that separates this, or even come up with different solutions, as we'll see when I start describing how I implemented these waypoints. So that's just kind of how it looks in the original Getaway Shootout. Now I'll actually explain these like yellow boundaries of these waypoints. So let me actually jump into just the notepad here. So let's say that we just have this map here we created, and we want to actually add waypoints in the game. So what if we want to add a spawn point like right here? So basically, we want to have the player, once it reaches the point, start spawning at that location. And there are multiple ways to know if the player got to that location. I think one of the easiest ways is to actually just have a little box collider here and set it to be a trigger so it actually doesn't collide with it, it just goes through it. So when the player then goes through that zone, the player will be notified, and we can just set that current waypoint as the spawn point. This solution works, but it does have a problem. So say if the player went over that zone, that waypoint would never actually be triggered, and the player would never spawn at that location, even though that they're past it in the map. And the easy solution to that would just be obviously make the spawn point bigger, so that the player collides it no matter how far or how high they are. But which this solution works, but I think there is a simpler solution to actually just define a boundary and to actually make that boundary infinite in size, defined in our code. And this boundary will just check if the player is to the right of this waypoint, and if the player is to the right, then we activate that as our waypoint, and the player will start spawning at that spawn point. I'm using spawn point, waypoint interchangeably because at this point we'll just consider them as the same, but when we do computer movement, there'll actually be some difference. So I guess I'll do another example right here. Say if we have a waypoint at this position. Well, now we can't just do an easy check for the right of the waypoint, because if the player is here, we actually don't want to create that waypoint. So we'll actually define in code another direction that the player can be in regards to the waypoint, and that is the up direction. So this waypoint will check if the player is to the right of the waypoint and if it is above the waypoint. So it corresponds to being in this zone right here. So that's the solution. Basically, we're defining waypoints to have these directions. It can be either to the right of the waypoint, or we can define it to be the left. And we can also additionally be above the waypoint or below the waypoint to actually trigger that as the active waypoint. And as we'll see when I start implementing this, this will just give us a nice way to chain these waypoints. So when the next one is active, or say if this starting one's active, then we look at the next waypoint and so forth, and we continue increase the waypoints as the player moves throughout those zones. So some of it still might not be super clear, but hopefully as I start coding this, it will make more sense, kind of the idea of these waypoints, just as like a set of checkpoints that the player can go to. Okay, so now I'm going to jump back into the project and we can actually start implementing this in code. So the first thing that I want to do is to actually create that waypoint script, that waypoint object, and that's just going to define the direction or that boundary of that waypoint to know when that waypoint is active. So I'm going to create a waypoint script like that. And I'm going to open it up in scripts. So as I was saying when I was drawing it out, we want the waypoints just to be a simple boundary with basically a set of two directions. And I'll actually create these directions as enums because they'll be easier to work with. So I'm going to create an enum horizontal direction. And the directions I'll do is one, you could ignore the horizontal direction, and then we'll do left, and then we'll actually do right as well. And then I'll copy this and create another enum, and this will be the vertical direction. And we'll have this as down, and we'll have that as up. So with the vertical direction, same thing. We can have this waypoint not focus on the vertical direction at all, or we can trigger it when it's below the waypoint or above the waypoint. And if you don't know, or if you haven't worked with enums before, enums are basically a way for a variable to be in a select state, and you define these states with actual strings. So it just makes it easier to work with and kind of easier to define in code. So then I'll actually define these variables up top. So I'm going to create a horizontal direction. And this is actually going to be the value of the variable. So I'll create, or I'll name it horizontal zone. And I'll do the same thing with the vertical direction. So these just define what states that this variable can be in, and this actually defines the variable here. And we'll default the horizontal zone just to be to the right of it. So I'm just going to say horizontal zone equals right. And yeah, that's the definition of these two horizontal zones that we'll be selecting in the editor. And the last thing that I want to define, kind of just as a data attribute, is to actually have an option to add an offset to the zone. And we'll make use of this offset in the future when we're actually creating these waypoints. But it will just be nice to have a way to have the waypoint zone to be a little offset from the actual position. So I'm going to say something like zone offset. And yeah, that's basically all we need to just define this simple boundary. If it's a horizontal boundary, vertical boundary, or if it's both. And the last thing now to do is to actually create a method, and I'll call it inZone, to actually let the players know if they're in this zone. So I'm going to say, well, we'll pass in a vector2, which is going to be the position of that player. And basically, we want to determine if that position that's being passed in is inside this zone. So, well, the first thing that we want to do is just get the difference between this position that we passed in and our position. So I'm going to call this difference. And I'm going to say position minus transform.position. So that gets the difference. I'll just make this a vector2. But I'll also add in that offset that we just created to make sure that's being accounted in the difference. So now we got the vector of our difference between us and the player. Now we just want to check if it is actually in the zone that we defined. So the first thing to check is to check if we're not in the horizontal zone. So if we are not, or if we are using the horizontal zone, so this is going to be kind of the opposite. We're checking for if it is false. So I'm going to say if horizontal zone does not equal horizontal direction none. So we actually have a horizontal direction corresponding to this waypoint. And then the other check that we'll actually do, since that we're checking the horizontal direction now, and maybe I'll just make this on a different line, is to actually check if now that difference corresponds with the actual horizontal direction. So if the difference, since it's horizontal, it would be x, is greater than 0. So this is true if the player is to the right of the waypoint. So we want to check if it's not corresponding to the correct horizontal direction. So let me just write this down, and it'll make a little more sense actually when I write it. So we want to be checking our horizontal zone equals to the right, something like this. So this can get a little confusing, but basically we're saying this check is here is if our waypoint is basically a zone to the right of the waypoint, and if the player is not to the right of the waypoint, basically we're not in the zone, so we can easily just return false. And I'll do the same thing now for the vertical zone. So vertical, oh, I actually named that wrong. So we'll do the same thing for the vertical zone. First, we'll check if we're actually using the vertical zone at all. So if the vertical direction is not none, then we'll next check the difference in y. So this is true if we're above the waypoint, but now we want to check if it doesn't equal the upwards direction. So do something like this: horizontal zone equals horizontal direction, or vertical direction, sorry. Something like that, and we want the vertical zone, return false. And yeah, this line can be confusing because this actually checks for both cases. It checks for the downwards direction and upwards direction, basically by comparing these two Boolean variables. So it might just take some time to think through that, but that should actually work, that logic, to check if we're not in the zone. And basically, if we do these two checks and we haven't returned false, well, then that means we're in the zone, so we'll return true after that. Okay, so I'm just going to save that, and that should be actually working now. The next thing I'll do is actually, well, first I'll bring in a way to visualize these waypoints. And this is what I made before the video. It's just a nice way to visualize the waypoint in the editor. So I'm just going to bring in this editor script I created beforehand. You don't really need to know about this, but you can check it out on the GitHub if you are curious on how I created this editor script. I'm just going to create folder editor, something like that. And then I'm just going to drag in the script that I created beforehand, which is just to visualize the waypoints. And one thing I did realize, I'm just going to remove one thing. Because I did actually make these spawnable, but we'll focus that on a future video. So again, this is just a script that I'm bringing in just to visualize these waypoints. Now I'm actually going to jump into the map and create these waypoints. So I'm going to create an empty game object called waypoint, or waypoints. And this will hold all of our waypoints for our map. So I'm just going to create a waypoint like that and attach that waypoint script. And this is what I was talking about, bringing in this visualization script. So we got a nice way now to visualize where that zone is corresponding for this waypoint. And this is a better visualization that I made in the original Getaway Shootout game. So hopefully it's easier kind of just to see. So as we define the code, we can have the horizontal direction to be left or right. And basically the yellow area is where this waypoint actually gets activated. So I'll set this one to right. And this will be our initial spawn point. So I'll set it to something like that. Then I'll create another waypoint up here, just to be another spawn point. Again, I'll just set it to be the right. And maybe just for some change, I'll actually create it to be a combination of right and up. And I'll do the same thing for another waypoint just over here. But you could do any kind of combination of these vertical zones and also adjust the zone offset to kind of adjust that boundary. Okay, so that's just some simple waypoints added to this map now. The next step is to actually be using these waypoints. And for that, I'm going to be creating another script in our scripts folder. And I'm going to call this a waypoint manager, which is the purpose of it is just going to be managing all these waypoints in our map. So I'm going to say waypoint manager. And I'm going to open this up and here. So like I was saying, this script is just going to be for managing all the waypoints on our map. So the first thing I think would be good to do is to get actually all the waypoints that we created in our map. And I'm just going to define something like this, a waypoints array that's holding all the waypoints in our map. And basically, I'll do it on awake just so it gets called at the very start. I'm just going to say waypoints equals get components and children of the waypoint. So basically, we'll, for right now at least, have all the waypoints just be children of this waypoint manager. And that way we can just get all the waypoints at the start. So now the next thing to do is actually have players to track and to actually update their current waypoint based on the current waypoint they're at right now, and if they're in the zone of the next waypoint. So I'm going to create, we can do like a transform, we can do array. I'll do actually a list of transforms. And I'll call this, call it players. I'll call it navigators to kind of make this general. Something like this, and then, oops, we want something like array list, I'm pretty sure. Let me just look at the syntax here a second. Okay, there wasn't a problem with the syntax. It was just, for some reason, the import was automatically imported wrong, but I have that in right. And we'll just initialize it to an empty list. But yeah, we don't have to worry too much about this list attribute, or this list structure right now, because I think in the future we'll actually change the data structure for this. But for right now, I think it'll be fine. So I'll actually create another list, and this will be our current waypoints for all the navigators. And I'll create, initialize it as an empty list. And so I'm just creating these as lists because the nice thing we'll do is just something like this, a method called add nav for navigator, and we'll just add the transform of the nav to this list. So something like navigators dot add nav, and we can also actually add, so we'll have to add to this list, this integer list as well, and we'll just start each navigator at the first waypoint. So I'm just gonna add, and since it's 0 index, it'll be actually 0. So add each navigator to have initialized the first waypoint. Okay, so we have something to track the actual navigator's transforms, and we actually have something to track the current waypoint index. Now, the next thing to do would be actually to update these values. So we want to loop through all these navigators and to basically update their current waypoint to be the next waypoint if they're in the next waypoint, or to go back to the previous waypoint if they left the current waypoint. So let's actually go through that now. So I'm just going to loop through for each. I'll do actually like a for loop, something like this. I less than navigators dot count. So we're looping through our navigators, and now we just want to do the checks of, as I just mentioned first. So first check is going to be check current waypoint, and if we're not in it, we want to decrease the current waypoint. So I'm going to do something like this. So navigators, or we want to get the current waypoint. So current waypoints .I. So this is the current waypoint that the player is at, and to get the current waypoint, we'll just access it something like this. So this is the index of that waypoint, so that's how we get the actual waypoint. And we want to be calling the in-zone function that we've created. And this in-zone function that we created, we pass in the player's position, and we can just do that by getting the current navigator and passing in position. So what this line is doing here is we're checking the current waypoint that we're at, and basically we want to check if we're not in that zone. Let me actually, I think it would make a lot more sense if I just jump over to the notepad, just refresh this. Okay, so as I was saying, if, let's say, it's kind of messy, the scene that I created. Let's say if that is the current waypoint that we're at, so the player is somewhere in here, but let's say the player actually leaves the zone and goes behind our current waypoint. Well, we actually want to set the current waypoint all the way back to the original waypoint, or the waypoint before that waypoint. And only when the player goes back into the zone, we set this one back to the waypoint that we're at. So let's actually implement that. So as I was having, we have the current waypoint, and basically we want to check if we're not in that zone, because this is when we want to decrease our current waypoint. So if we're not in our current waypoint zone, simply just get the current waypoint and decrease it. Now we just want to do the other check. So if, let's see, yeah, the other check will actually be a little more involved, because we just want to make sure that, actually I'm going to create a reference to this. That way we can easily just reference this. So first we want to make sure that that current waypoint is less than the maximum waypoints, because we don't want to increase the waypoints to be out of bounds. We always want to make sure it's in bounds. So I'm just going to do something like this. And let's see, I think it has to be one less. I'll double check on that. And then as I'm writing, so this is where we actually want to check to make sure that the waypoint is in zone. So if we are in zone of the next waypoint, well, then we actually want to increase the current waypoint. Something like this. So let's see, if the current waypoint is 1, and if there's a size of 2, yeah, that should be good like that. And I guess one check that we'll actually have to do to make sure we don't go below 0 is to do something like this. And yeah, that's basically the simple way of adding this waypoints. Basically, every update call will update all of our navigators to make sure that they're at the correct waypoint. So I'm going to save that. And I think for right now, we can actually debug this. So I'm going to actually move this into a different method. I'm going to say something like update navs, and we'll just call it an update. And I'll actually add a debug, so we can debug this by looping through our navigators again. And basically we can use Unity's debug.drawLine to actually draw a line between the current navigator and to the actual position of our current waypoint. So if we do something like waypoints to get the current waypoint that our player's at, and just get the transform dot position of that waypoint. And I'll just do something like color dot green to debug this. So this is just a nice way for debugging stuff in Unity. You can do this debug.drawLine. They'll just show up in the editor while we're playing. So I'm going to jump to our map because we haven't added this waypoint manager. So I'm going to add the waypoint manager basically to this parent of all these waypoints. So on the start, the waypoint manager will get all of its children as we defined in the wake function. And then the next thing I want to do, well, this actually won't work yet because we haven't actually passed in these navigators to be tracked. So I'm going to do that in the game manager. Basically, we have a function that creates players, and we want to add add the navigator every time we create a player, which will only be at the start. So the first thing I'll do, we'll get a reference to this waypoint manager. And the waypoint manager, for right now, we can just do something like find first object by type, waypoint manager. We'll just do this for right now, but in the future we'll do it something like when we're creating the map, we'll get a reference to this waypoint manager. So now we got a reference to the waypoint manager, and basically when we create a player, we just want to add them to be tracked on the waypoint. So I'm just gonna put in the player's transform to be tracked. So that should be enough to actually debug this and to see if this is actually working. So I'm gonna jump to the play button, test this. So as I was saying, we now have these like green lines in the editor to see where the current navigator is, which is the player, and what current waypoint. So if I move to up here, sorry, so like this. Okay, so let me actually select the waypoint so it's easier to visualize. As you can see, when the player basically reached this zone, this yellow zone, the waypoint was increased to the next waypoint, as you can see, like that. And then if we keep going, do something like this, to the next waypoint, it increases to the next waypoint, which is what we want. And then just to check, if we go to out of the current waypoint that we're at, we go back to the waypoint that we're at before. So the waypoint system seems to be working. I think the last step just for this video right now is to actually use these waypoints in the spawn. And we'll just, for right now, consider that every waypoint that we're at is going to be a spawn point. So I'm going to jump back here. So we need a way to get the current waypoint from our waypoint manager. So I'm going to do something like public waypoint get nav cur waypoint. And basically we need to pass in the player that we want to get the current waypoint. So I'm going to pass in it as a transform, and we'd just been referring them to as navigators, which is good. So basically we need to get the index of this navigator because that's how we get the current waypoint, because we're just passing in the navigator. And the way to do that, I believe, since we're using lists, if we do something like navigators.index of, and then we pass in that player that we want to get the index of, and we'll just set it as something like that. And if we haven't added the waypoint or this navigator, it will actually be out of bounds, so we should definitely check. I'm pretty sure it returns -1 if it isn't, so if. And then we can like throw something like that. I don't know if index out of the range is the right exception. I don't know. We'll just return for right now. something like that. But in the future, I'll add some actual error code. But for right now, we can just do something like that. Okay, so with that in place, we can then simply return the waypoint just by getting the index that we retrieved there and getting the corresponding waypoint. So I'm going to save that, and then now we can actually use this method. So if I go over to our game manager, basically we want to just use that method for actually spawning the player. And if we go to our respawn player loop, currently right now we're setting the player's position by this function right here. And this is actually a function I created a while back, just off video. But all it does is really just set the player's body and also the rotation and the arm rotation. And so what we can actually do here is to actually get that spawn point from the waypoint manager. So I'm going to say something like spawn position, and it'll just be the waypoint manager, and then we'll use that method that we just created, get nav cur waypoint, and we'll pass in that transform of the player. Something like that. And then also this is returning a waypoint, so then we'll just do transform.position for the actual position of that waypoint. And this is kind of why that we have this zone offset, because sometimes we want the actual spawn point to be in a different location of that zone to trigger when that zone is actually active. And then the last thing we have to do is just, instead of spawning the player at the 0 origin, we'll spawn it at the spawn position. So I'm going to jump back into the game now, and let's see if this is working. And also I'm just going to reset these back to have no vertical offset because I was noticing when the player just gets slightly below that line, it was resetting back to the original waypoint, which is what the functionality should be, but for this map it just makes more sense for that. And now if I click play, hopefully we should see the players spawning at the whatever waypoint they're currently at. So if I move the player on the right up to this waypoint up here, well, let's first, I'll just have the player jump into the cliff right there. So the player dies, and hopefully we should see the player respawn at that original waypoint, which it did. The player can go backwards now, and since we haven't fully implemented this in yet, the player actually will spawn at the first waypoint going back. If I shoot the player, which isn't what we want exactly right now. We want it to always be, oh, I guess interesting that it did actually spawn at that waypoint. We always want the waypoint to be spawning the furthest to the right or the furthest in the level. And I'm not sure, it seemed like that actually did it, but I know we haven't implemented it yet, so yeah, that'll be something actually we'll be implementing next video, is to actually make sure that we save the player's progress to the farthest spawn point. It is interesting, so if I it might not be currently working correctly. If the first player dies like that, we'll see if they spawn at that waypoint. Okay, no, that seems correct in that sense. But I'll check over the video to make sure everything is working correctly that way. One thing we can actually do right now also is to have the players spawn at the first waypoint at the beginning of the game. So when we're creating players, create players here, and I'm pretty sure we don't set a waypoint or set a position yet. So I'm just going to actually do something like this. Waypoint manager, get current waypoint. Since we just added that player, it should be fine. And again, just get the position of that waypoint. And again, we'll just use actually that same method that we defined down there. And I'll just get the position like this. So we're just doing the same thing as the spawn point, just to get the player's position. And we could actually make this a method since this is duplicate code, but this might actually change up in the future. But now let me just test if that works to set the players. So they should spawn at this first spawn point, and it seems like they do, except, so there might be something going on here because second player is not spawning at the current 0 waypoint. There must be indice. Oh, okay, yep, that was the error. Okay, so we're just getting the index of the navigator, and we're returning waypoints of that index of the navigator. We actually don't want that. We want to use that current waypoints that we created, and then I. So yeah, that should be actually what we want. It is a little confusing to keep doing this index to get the current waypoint, and then the index to get the waypoint. But it should be fine for now, and actually in the future, we actually might change up that data structure to make it easier to work with. So now if we do what we were doing before, I'm just going to shoot this player. They should spawn at 0, like that. Now if I bring the player up to here, actually I'll just have them jump off the cliff. So it should spawn at the second waypoint, which was the most recent one, which it did. But the functionality I was mentioning before that we'll do in the next video is, since that the player reached this third waypoint, when it goes back, we want to keep this one as the most active spawn point. So when the player dies, it should spawn at this waypoint. But currently it spawns there. So that's basically the main functionality of the waypoint system. In the next video, we'll actually, as I just was saying, get to actually implementing more of the spawn point system to keep track of the furthest along spawn point. And then after that, we'll focus more on the waypoints as computer movement. And yeah, that should be getting the game pretty far. Yeah, if you have any suggestions, definitely leave comments, and I'll do my best to read them. But yeah, I'll see you in the next video. Thank you.